The word autism, in a sense, is a relatively new word within the interpreting profession. While it has been around since the mid-70s, interpreters have not latched a hold of this concept until about 10 years ago. Deaf Choice Incorporated states that our thoughts often gravitate to race or gender when we think of words like discrimination or prejudice. These words are discussed often or heard or seen in conversations, television, or radio news and print. Most of the time, a minority group is being or feels it is being oppressed and maltreated. We hear these words often because they are part of a larger culture of hearing people. However, deaf and hard of hearing people experience being discriminated against or encounter prejudice by people referred to as autists. Autism can be defined as discrimination or prejudice based on a person's inability or lack of ability to hear. Deaf Choice, Inc. further states that in deaf culture, calling someone an autist would be the same as calling someone a racist. Tom Humphreys invented the term Audism in 1975 to describe an oppressive attitude that some people, agencies, businesses, or organizations have towards the deaf or hard of hearing. Humphreys, while in a doctoral program at the Union Institute in Cincinnati, Ohio, used the word autism in his dissertation, communicating across cultures, deaf, hearing, and language learning. He defined it as the notion that one is superior based on one's ability to hear or behave in the manner of one who hears. NTID has produced a series called Deaf Visual History Interviews. In one of these series, they interviewed Dr. Tom Humphreys, and in part 2 of that interview, Humphreys discusses how he came up with the word autism and his experiences dealing with autism. We don't have time for me to show you the video, but you can see it on YouTube by following this link. Before recognizing sign language interpreting as a profession, some of those who interpreted for the deaf held the belief that deaf people needed help and could not take care of themselves. A few examples of their behavior include adding advice or answering on their behalf, for example, in an educational setting. But this also occurred in medical and legal settings. It was the interpreter's belief that because the person was deaf, they were less intelligent or had less knowledge about the world or treated them as such. In 2005, Dennis Coakley stated that in the early days of sign language interpreting, members of the community would determine for themselves whether or when a person possessed sufficient communicative competence and had also demonstrated sufficient trustworthiness that they would be asked to interpret, transliterate. After the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf, RID, was established, interpreters' qualifications were determined by other interpreters. The deaf community no longer had a say in whether they felt an interpreter was qualified or trustworthy enough to interpret for them. Autism still exists in sign language interpreting to this day in the United States and in the province of Ontario, Canada. There are laws that ensure the right to communicative access. However, with these laws, the deaf people are negatively labeled as disabled. Also, due to these laws, there is a high demand for interpreters, but only a short supply. Therefore, deaf people can only get access to things like doctor's appointments and etc. if there is an interpreter available. The online blog, Interpreter's Life, or TERP's Life, does a great job talking about the various interpreting models used in an audist world. The blog gives credit to David Bar-Zur and his blog post integrating the interpreting service models as its source. I want to share portions of this fantastic post with you and encourage you to read the entire post. As interpreters, we have to be aware of the audist perspective of everything related to deafness. Otherwise, we run the risk of becoming a part of the audist establishment as much as other professionals have. One of the easiest ways to view this potential risk in our field is to analyze the different models of interpreting that have existed over the years, such as the helper model, which is relevant to this presentation. When our profession first began to establish itself, we often approached interpreting from the helper model. Primarily, we viewed deaf individuals as needing the aid of an interpreter to communicate with the hearing world. This model grew from the fact that most interpreters were family members or close friends of deaf individuals. This view also gives rise to a relatively significant problem. By accepting a helper's point of view, interpreters become allied with the audist establishment, accepting and reinforcing the medical paradigm of deafness. Something is broken, sick, or disabled, and the ailment perspective of deafness. It is clear why this model has been viewed as harming the interpreting profession and deaf consumers. Young students most often enter the profession following the helper model, viewing deaf individuals as people needing and requiring assistance. After graduation from the ITP, the young professional gains more years of experience, and they progress to the more accurate communication facilitator model. And finally, they plateau as seasoned professionals using the facilitator, bye-bye, ally, or progressive models, depending on the situational needs. Deaf Choice Incorporated provides a list of the many forms autism can come in. First, not signing in the presence of deaf individuals when you know how to sign. Negative expectations or views of those who cannot speak with their voices. Third, ignoring or not providing reasonable accommodations for deaf or hard of hearing people. Fourth, inappropriate, harmful, or lower expectations of success held by some educators, administrators, audiologists, or speech therapists, interpreters, corporate business employees, or others in professional positions towards deaf and hard of hearing people. Fifth, viewing hearing people and hearing culture as superior to deaf or hard of hearing people and deaf culture. Sixth, not allowing deaf people input or their rise to positions of authority. Seventh, parents of deaf children insist on forcing their child to conform only to the hearing culture at the expense of or instead of their unique sense of belonging to deaf culture because the parent sees the child as limited by a nonverbal, non-hearing minority. Deaf Choice, Inc. continues by stating that we do not hear the term autism often because it applies to a minority of subcultures. Even some deaf or hard of hearing people are not familiar with the term or their autistic behaviors. Some deaf or hard of hearing people may feel their views of their language, ability to use speech, to communicate, or their attitude toward deaf culture make them superior to others. Deaf people have pride in and a sense of belonging to their culture. They may feel autists are attempting to destroy or oppress deaf culture. Some hearing people want deaf people to be just like hearing people. And these hearing people believe that deaf people must conform and adopt English, lip reading, speech, and other hearing ways of communication at the exclusion of embracing the natural language of the deaf, American Sign Language. These people subconsciously and sometimes consciously do not accept deaf culture coupled with this language or ASL-based educational methodologies, which have proven very successful over the years. So autism is prevalent in the community. Interpreters can convince themselves that they are not autistic because the end justifies the means, or own your own sense of autism, or find yourself helping your deaf consumer. Speak to a colleague within the framework of the Code of Professional Conduct. Seek their feedback. And one final note. Millions of people have had limited or no contact with people who are deaf or hard of hearing. You cannot expect them to know all the appropriate do's and don'ts of interacting with someone who is deaf or hard of hearing. Even after they become educated, they may still make an error in judgment or behavior. An autist is someone, like us, who has been around deaf or hard of hearing people and has been educated about appropriate expectations or perspectives and knows the difference between discriminating or prejudice toward a deaf or hard of hearing person. Yet they continue to act superior, belittle, look down upon, make negative comments about, or do not respect people who are deaf or hard of hearing. You have the choice to discriminate or be prejudiced toward any race or culture. I hope you appreciate the fact that there is a world out there with some very interesting deaf and hard of hearing people who can enrich your life's adventure. Don't go through life with a myopic or nearsighted view. Stretch yourself and discover all that life has to offer in treating others with a sense of equality. It's not easy for interpreters. We are confronted with opportunities to help, and that leads to autistic thinking and behaviors.